My name is Sam Holbrook, and I was 41 years old when it happened. I had spent the last year running, from people, from places, from myself. After losing my wife and daughter in a car accident, the world felt hollow, and so did I. That's how I ended up in Alaska, wandering in my RV, hoping the vast wilderness could fill the emptiness inside me. That's how I found the Devil's Cradle. I'd heard about it from a pamphlet at a gas station in Gustavus. Glacier Bay National Park had plenty of hidden gems, but the Devil's Cradle stood out. The valley was said to be breathtaking, with cliffs that echoed even the smallest sounds. What drew me in, though, were the rumors, stories of strange music and an unshakable eeriness. A writer had called it the loneliest place in Alaska. Loneliness suited me fine. The road leading to the Devil's Cradle was little more than a rugged trail. My RV rattled and groaned as I navigated the potholes and loose gravel. When I finally arrived, the valley was as stunning as promised. Sheer rock walls rose on either side, framing a frozen river that snaked through the hollow. Patches of snow clung to the rocks, and the air was still, almost too still. I parked the RV in a small clearing at the edge of the valley and stepped out into the silence. It felt unnatural, like the land was holding its breath. The first sign of something strange came that night. I was sitting by my small fire trying to coax out some words for a journal entry. Writing had been my way of coping, though it felt more like an obligation than a relief. Then I heard it. Faint music, drifting on the cold wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the acoustics, but the melody grew clearer, soft and mournful, as if played on a violin. It stirred something deep in my chest, a pang of grief I thought I'd buried. I stood and scanned the valley, but there was no sign of anyone, just shadows stretching long and thin across the snow. The music faded as suddenly as it began, leaving me shaken. The next morning, I met another traveler. His name was Ben, a wiry man in his 30s with a backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He appeared out of nowhere as I was making coffee, startling me so badly I nearly spilled the pot. "Didn't think anyone else would be out here," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "Same," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. He looked uneasy, like he couldn't decide whether to sit or keep moving. "You hear it yet? The music?" I froze. "Yeah, last night." "You need to leave," he said, his voice low. "Whatever's out here, it isn't friendly." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he was already backing away. "Just don't follow the song," he muttered, before disappearing down the trail. That night, the music returned. It was louder now, weaving through the valley with a haunting clarity. This time, it wasn't just sound, it was a memory. The melody was familiar, tugging at the edges of my mind. And then I remembered. It was the song my daughter used to play on the violin. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of longing and dread. I stepped out of the RV, flashlight in hand, and followed the sound. It led me toward the river, where the moonlight glinted off the ice. At the edge of the bank, I saw her. A girl in white, standing perfectly still. Her back was to me, but I could see her dark hair, her small frame. She looked just like my daughter. She was humming the melody now, soft and sweet. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She turned her head slightly, but not enough for me to see her face. Then she stepped forward, onto the ice, and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, I was determined to make sense of what was happening. I searched the area where I'd seen the girl and found an old campsite. Nothing more than a few rotted planks and rusted equipment. Buried in the snow was a violin. Its strings intact, but the wood warped and blackened. Inscribed on the side was a name, Ludwig Keller. The name tugged at my memory. I returned to the RV and searched online, finding an old story about a violinist who had disappeared in the Devil's Cradle decades ago. Keller had come to the valley seeking inspiration but had never left. Locals claimed he'd gone mad, driven by the same music I was hearing. The music was relentless that night, louder and more insistent. The girl in white appeared again, closer this time. She was humming, her face half hidden in shadow. I wanted to call out, but fear rooted me in place. Then she pointed toward the cliffs where a narrow path wound upward. The message was clear. She wanted me to follow. "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She only hummed that same mournful tune. Against my better judgment, I followed her. The path was treacherous, icy and steep, but I couldn't stop. It felt like the music was pulling me, promising answers, or maybe just an end to the emptiness I carried. The path led to a plateau overlooking the valley. The wind whipped around me, but the music was deafening now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The girl stood at the edge of the cliff, her back to me. "This isn't real," I said, more to myself than to her. She turned then, and I saw her face. It wasn't Lily. It was something else, something twisted and wrong. Her eyes black pits and her mouth curled into a mockery of a smile. "You came for her," the spirit said, its voice layered with malice. "But she's not here." I realized then that the spirit had been feeding on my grief, using my memories to draw me deeper into its trap. The violin in my hands felt heavy, like it was part of the spirit itself. I knew what I had to do. "You won't take me," I said, and I smashed the violin against the rocks. The music stopped. The girl in white let out a scream, her form shattering like glass. The valley fell silent, and for the first time in days, the air felt clear. I found my way back to the RV as dawn broke. The valley seemed different now, still eerie, but no longer oppressive. I packed up and left, the road winding away without the strange loops that had trapped me before. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit wasn't truly gone, just dormant, waiting for someone else to bring their grief into its domain. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a small sense of peace. The music was gone, and with it, the weight I'd been carrying. Sometimes, though, I hear it again in my dreams, the song of the Devil's Cradle, haunting and beautiful, calling me back. My name is Evelyn Marsh, but most people call me Evie. I was 34 when it happened, and I had just left behind a messy breakup, a failing career, and what felt like my old life. I decided to take my RV through Alaska for some solitude, a little inspiration, and maybe a fresh start. But instead of healing, I found Fireweed Hollow. It was the kind of place you hear about in whispers, tucked deep in the Kenai Peninsula, where even the locals wouldn't go. Overgrown with bright pink fireweed flowers, it looked beautiful from a distance, a field of wild color surrounded by dark, ancient woods. But something about it felt wrong the moment I arrived. I'd heard about it from another traveler at a gas station. He'd said, "If you're looking for a story, check out Fireweed Hollow. It's got everything: ghosts, curses, disappearances. People say the place doesn't let you leave." I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. The road leading to Fireweed Hollow was barely a road at all, more like a path carved out by time and neglect. My RV rattled and groaned as I drove over potholes and tree roots. By the time I pulled into the campground, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the flowers. The place was a graveyard of forgotten campers. Rusted swings dangled from chains. Old fire pits sat cold and unused, and an ancient wooden sign creaked in the wind. It read, "Fireweed Hollow. Welcome." I parked near an overgrown cabin and stepped out. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and flowers. Despite the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "This is perfect," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Creepy, but perfect. As a travel writer, I'd been chasing a story for months. Something that would grab attention and save my career. This was it. I'd barely set up my camera gear when I heard footsteps. A woman emerged from the woods, her hair wild and streaked with gray. She carried a rifle slung over her shoulder and had the look of someone who lived off the land, weathered but sharp. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rough and low. "Excuse me?" I asked, startled. "This place doesn't like visitors," she continued, her eyes darting to the trees. "If you're smart, you'll leave before dark." I laughed nervously. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm just here for a night, taking some photos, writing a story." "You won't leave," she interrupted. "None of them do." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared into the woods, her warning hanging in the air. As night fell, the campground transformed. The bright flowers that had seemed so inviting during the day now looked unnatural under the pale moonlight. Their colors muted, their shapes oddly sinister. I lit a fire and settled into my camping chair, trying to focus on my notebook. But the sounds started soon after, the faint rustling of leaves, soft enough to be the wind but rhythmic, intentional. Then came the howls. Not wolves or coyotes, but something in between, like an animal imitating a human scream. "Probably just wildlife," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. At some point, I heard footsteps circling my RV. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the fireweed, swaying as if touched by an unseen breeze. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever story I thought I was chasing wasn't worth the unease creeping into my chest. But when I tried to drive away, the road seemed different. Twisting, looping back on itself. Every turn brought me back to the campground, no matter which direction I took. By the third attempt, I stopped the RV in frustration. Stepping out, I saw the flowers again, surrounding me like a pink tide. Their beauty now felt suffocating, as if they were alive, watching me. I found an old trail leading into the woods and decided to follow it, hoping to find another way out. That's when I found the carvings. Symbols etched into trees, intricate and unfamiliar. Some looked like warning signs, others like prayers. Beneath one of the carvings was a rusted metal trap, its teeth bent and smeared with dried blood. By the time I returned to the campground, I was exhausted. The air felt thicker now, almost unbreathable, and the forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. That's when I saw it, movement among the fireweed. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it stood upright, tall and gaunt, with limbs too long for its body. Its face was pale, its eyes sunken pits of darkness. It didn't move toward me. It just stared, as if deciding what to do. I ran to my RV and locked the door, my heart hammering in my chest. From inside, I heard whispers. They weren't loud, but they were clear. My name repeated over and over. "Evai!" Desperate for answers, I remembered the woman who'd warned me. I found her cabin a short hike from the campground, a crude structure pieced together from salvaged wood and metal. She answered the door with her rifle in hand. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her expression grim. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What's happening here?" She sighed and gestured for me to sit by her fire. They call it the wendigo. It feeds on hunger, not just for food, but for pain, guilt, regret. It gets inside your head, twists the land around you. Once it's got you, it doesn't let go. "How do I get out?" I asked. "You don't," she said simply, unless you face it. The wendigo doesn't just kill, it consumes everything you've buried inside yourself. You've got to give it nothing to feed on. That night, I stayed at the campground, unable to think of another plan. The fireweed seemed closer now, pressing in on all sides. The symbols on the trees glowed faintly, as if alive. And then the wendigo appeared. It stepped into the clearing, its gaunt frame barely human. Its voice came next, a horrible mimicry of mine. "You're not enough," it said, its words twisting like a knife. "You failed. You always fail." I froze as memories surged, my failed relationship, the career I couldn't salvage, the fear that had driven me to Fireweed Hollow in the first place. The wendigo was feeding on it, growing stronger as my resolve crumbled. But then I remembered Maggie's words. Give it nothing to feed on. I stood my ground, trembling but defiant. "You're right," I said aloud. "I've failed, I've messed up, but that doesn't mean I'm done." The wendigo shrieked, a sound that tore through the night like a storm. It lunged, but I didn't move. Instead, I stared it down, letting every regret surface, acknowledging it, and then letting it go. The wendigo stopped inches from me, its face contorted in rage. Slowly, it began to dissolve, its form scattering like ash in the wind. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. When dawn broke, the road out of Fireweed Hollow was clear. I didn't look back as I drove away, though the fireweed still bloomed in my rearview mirror. Months later, I wrote about Fireweed Hollow, though I left out the details no one would believe. The experience changed me, not just because I survived, but because I faced the parts of myself I'd been running from for years. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear whispers again, but now they're my own voice, reminding me to keep going, because no matter what, I'm still here. My name is Kate Carter, and I was 29 when it happened. This story took place deep in the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, at a place called Dead Man's Lake. I'd heard the stories, rumors of strange disappearances, eerie sightings, but I never believed any of it. Not until I saw it myself. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a chance to prove to myself that I could still lead in the wild. After a tragic accident during my guiding days, I'd been struggling to regain my confidence. This was going to be my redemption. But Dead Man's Lake had other plans. The group consisted of my childhood friend JJ, who was 27 and as goofy as ever, my younger cousin Lila, 25 and obsessed with folklore, and my boyfriend David, 30, who would rather have been anywhere but the Alaskan wilderness. "We'll bond," I had told them. "It'll be fun." The trip started badly. The unmaintained logging road leading to the lake was worse than expected. Potholes and deep ruts jostled the RV, and by the time we got stuck in a muddy patch, tempers were already flaring. "This is ridiculous," David snapped, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Why are we even here, Kate? You said this road was passable." "It was on the map," I shot back, though I felt the sting of his words. The truth was, I'd underestimated the route, but I wasn't about to admit it. JJ chuckled nervously, trying to break the tension. "Hey, think of it as an adventure. It's like the Oregon Trail, but with less dysentery." Lila, ever the optimist, was already pulling out her camera. "Did you know this area has some of the highest reported sightings of the Kushda? Shapeshifters. They mimic voices, faces." "Great," David muttered. "Just what we need, creepy ghost stories." By the time we reached Dead Man's Lake, the sun was setting. The water was eerily still, reflecting the darkened sky like a mirror. A dense forest loomed around the shoreline, the trees so tightly packed they looked like a solid wall of green and black. "Perfect spot," Lila said, snapping photos. "It's exactly how I imagined." JJ set up his faulty tent with duct tape and a prayer, while David grumbled over the broken stove. I focused on making camp, trying to ignore the nagging sense that something was off. That night, as we sat around the fire, the first signs appeared. A faint whooping sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't the call of any animal I recognized, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Just the wind," I said, more to reassure myself than anyone else. But then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was JJ playing a prank. He had a history of that sort of thing. But when I looked at him, he was staring into the forest with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Lila said, already grabbing her camera. She was always chasing the weird and unexplained. "It sounded like someone said my name," JJ whispered. We listened, and for a moment, there was nothing but the crackling fire and the soft rustle of leaves. Then we heard it. A faint, unmistakable whisper. "Jag." Lila turned pale. "That's not funny," she said, glaring at JJ. "It's not me," he protested, his voice shaking. The next day, Lila insisted on exploring the area. She was determined to find evidence of the kushta. David refused to leave camp, muttering something about how this was all a waste of time, so it was just me, JJ, and Lila. The forest felt wrong. Trails twisted and turned, leading us in circles. Landmarks we'd passed earlier seemed to appear again, as if the forest itself was shifting. Then we found the carvings. Strange symbols etched into the bark of a tree. Lila's excitement was palpable. "These are protective symbols," she explained. "They're supposed to ward off spirits." "Great," JJ said, snapping a photo with his phone. Because this place wasn't creepy enough. That night, the forest seemed to close in around us. The whooping calls grew louder, and the whispers returned, this time accompanied by movement in the trees. Shadows darted between the trunks, too quick and too human to be animals. "Just stay in the tent," I told everyone. "It's probably just some local kids messing with us." I didn't believe it, but it was the only thing I could say to keep them calm. By the third day, things had escalated. David woke up to find his backpack contents spilled out around the camp, his clothes soaked with muddy water. Nearby, the same protective symbols from the tree had been carved into the ground. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm done. We're leaving. Today. Good luck finding the road," Lila muttered. "We're lost, remember?" As we argued, JJ wandered off with his camera, drawn by movement near the water's edge. It was Lila who noticed he was gone. "JJ?" she called, her voice rising. "Where are you?" We found his camera first, lying in the mud. The lens was cracked, and the last image it had captured showed a tall, humanoid figure with unnaturally long limbs. Its face was grotesquely distorted, stretched into a grin that made my stomach turn. Then we found the blood. Panic set in as night fell. JJ was gone, and we had no idea what had taken him, or if he was even alive. Lila was crying, David was shouting, and I was trying to keep it together. "Listen to me," I said, gripping their shoulders. "We stick together. We don't wander off. Whatever's out there, we can't let it divide us." But the kushta had other plans. As we packed our gear, the whispers began again, louder this time. And then we saw them. Figures emerging from the forest, their faces eerily familiar. One of them looked like me, another looked like JJ. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. "It's them," Lila whispered. "They're trying to lure us." We ran, the forest closing in around us. Trails that had seemed clear before now twisted and branched into dead ends. The Kushda were everywhere, their grotesque grins glowing faintly in the darkness. Lila tripped, and I pulled her to her feet, my heart pounding in my chest. David, lagging behind, shouted for us to wait, but the sounds of pursuit were too close. When we finally stumbled back into camp, I remembered Lila's words about the protective symbols. Using a knife, I carved one into the ground, praying it would hold them off. It didn't. The Kushta surrounded us, their laughter echoing through the trees. One of them stepped forward, wearing JJ's face. Its voice was a perfect mimicry of his. "Don't leave me," it said, its grin widening. "Stay with us." I grabbed Lila and David and bolted for the lake. The water shimmered unnaturally under the moonlight. And I remembered something Lila had read. The Kushta were tied to the lake. "If we destroy the carvings near the lake," I said, "maybe we can break their hold." Using my knife, I hacked at the carvings we'd found earlier. The Kushta screamed, a sound so inhuman it made my ears ring. As the last symbol was destroyed, they vanished, their forms dissipating like smoke. We made it back to the RV and managed to get it unstuck. None of us spoke as we drove away, the forest seeming to watch us go. JJ's body was never found. Even now, I hear his voice sometimes, whispering in the dead of night, "Don't leave me here." My name is Ben Carter, and I'm 41 years old. I've spent the last 4 years living in my RV, traveling from one remote place to another, trying to outrun a past I can't seem to escape. This time, I thought Tongass National Forest in Alaska would give me the quiet I needed. The idea of camping alone in the misty wilderness sounded like the perfect way to clear my head. I couldn't have been more wrong. This happened last November. I'd parked my RV along a rough dirt road that cut through the forest. It was off-season, so I had the place to myself. Or so I thought. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches tangled and heavy with rain. The air smelled of moss and decay, and the fog hung thick, curling through the trees like smoke. It should have been peaceful, but from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. I met Eli the first evening. He was chopping wood outside a cabin a little way up the road, his weathered face half hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. I nodded to him as I passed, and he called out. "Not many people out here this time of year," he said, leaning on his axe. "That's the idea," I replied, forcing a smile. He squinted at me like he was trying to figure something out. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just up the road. Figured I'd check out the trails." Eli frowned. "Stay close to the road," he said. "And if you hear anything strange, don't follow it." I laughed nervously. "What kind of strange?" "The echo," he said, his voice low. "It lures people, uses voices to draw you in." "Ghost stories?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Eli didn't smile. "Just watch yourself." That night, the rain came hard, drumming on the roof of the RV. I curled up with a book, trying to ignore the unease that had been gnawing at me since I'd arrived. The fog outside the windows seemed thicker than before, pressing against the glass. It was past midnight when I first heard it, a faint voice carried on the wind. "Ben!" I froze, the book slipping from my hands. It sounded like Mike, a friend I'd lost in the fire that ended my career as a firefighter. I hadn't heard his voice in years, but there was no mistaking it. "Ben, help me." The voice was coming from the forest. I told myself it wasn't real, that it had to be the wind or my imagination. But the sound came again, clearer this time, and my chest tightened. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, dredging up old memories because of the solitude. I decided to hike the trail Eli had mentioned, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The forest was dense, the trail winding through towering trees draped in moss. The further I went, the darker it seemed to get, as if the fog were stealing the light. I reached an old logging camp after about an hour, a collection of decaying buildings and rusting machinery overrun by ferns and vines. It was eerie, but it made for great photos. As I was packing up to leave, a woman appeared on the trail. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing a bright yellow rain jacket that stood out against the gray forest. "Hi," she said, smiling. "Didn't think I'd see anyone else out here." "Same," I said. "I'm Ben." "Lisa," she replied. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just up the road." "Brave," she said with a nervous laugh. "This place gives me the creeps." "Why's that?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. It just feels off." We chatted for a few more minutes before she headed back down the trail. I watched her disappear into the fog, feeling strangely uneasy. Something about her seemed too fleeting, like she didn't quite belong there. That night, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just Mike's, it was Lisa's, calling out from the woods, "Ben, I need help." I clenched my fists, staring at the door of the RV. It was impossible. Lisa had left hours ago, heading in the opposite direction. There was no way she could be out there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, like a crowd trying to get my attention. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, then harder, as if someone were pounding on the side of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but trees. The knocking stopped, but the whispers continued, fading into the darkness. I went to see Eli the next morning, my nerves shot. He didn't seem surprised when I told him what had happened. "The echo's playing with you," he said. "It uses voices to lure you deeper. It knows your pain, feeds on it." "How do I stop it?" I asked. Eli handed me a small talisman, carved from bone and wrapped in string. "This'll help, but only for a while. Best thing you can do is leave." I nodded, clutching the talisman. But part of me didn't want to leave. I didn't know why, but it felt like I couldn't. That night, the echo came for me. The fog was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The voices started again, Mike, Lisa, and now others I didn't recognize. They sounded desperate, pleading for help. Then I saw the shadows. Dark, shifting figures moving just beyond the tree line, their forms barely distinguishable from the mist. My chest tightened as one of them stepped closer. It had no face, just glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "Ben," the voices whispered, overlapping and growing louder. "Come with us." I grabbed the talisman and held it tightly, feeling its warmth against my skin. The shadows hesitated, but they didn't leave. I don't remember deciding to leave the RV. It was as if something pulled me outside. The talisman burned hot in my hand as I stumbled into the forest, following the voices. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches clawing at my jacket. I found myself in a clearing, the ground charred and littered with bones. The air smelled of smoke and decay, and in the center stood the echo, a massive, shifting figure of darkness, its form constantly changing. It spoke in Mike's voice. "You could have saved us, Ben. Why didn't you save us?" My knees buckled as the memories flooded back. The fire, the heat, the screams. I'd tried to save them, but it hadn't been enough. "You don't belong here," the echo whispered. "Come with us. Make it right." I don't know what came over me, but I screamed. I screamed at the echo, at the forest, at myself. I told it I wasn't afraid anymore, that I wouldn't let it take me. The talisman burned brighter, and the echo recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. I ran, clutching the talisman as I barreled through the trees. The voices chased me, their cries growing fainter with each step. When I reached the road, the first light of dawn was breaking through the fog. I never went back for the RV. Eli's cabin was empty when I returned, as if no one had lived there in years. Even now, I hear the echo sometimes in my dreams. But I survived. And for now, that's enough. My name is Olivia Harper, and I'm 32 years old. I've made a career out of photographing the forgotten places of the world. Abandoned towns, crumbling buildings, places that seem to hold whispers of the past. That's what brought me to Rangel St. Elias National Park in Alaska last September. I was there to document the remains of the old Kenicott mines for a feature story. It was supposed to be a quick solo trip, just me, my RV, and my camera. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The park ranger I met at the trailhead, Jim, had given me a strange look when I told him where I was heading. "Kenicott, huh? You planning to camp up there?" he asked, leaning on his truck. His face was weathered, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Just for a couple of nights," I replied, loading my gear into my pack. "I'll be careful." He shook his head. "It's not the bears you gotta worry about. People say the miners never left that place." I laughed it off. "Ghost stories, right? Adds to the charm." Jim didn't smile. "Just don't stay after dark in the mine. And if you hear anything at all, don't follow it." I waved off his warnings. I'd heard similar stories before, tales meant to spook tourists. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I wasn't about to start now. The Kenicott site was everything I hoped it would be. The buildings, though weathered and overgrown, were hauntingly beautiful. Tall, skeletal structures against a backdrop of endless wilderness. The air was crisp, and the silence felt sacred. I parked my RV just off a dirt road, about a mile from the main site, and spent the first day exploring. My camera captured everything. The rusted machinery, the crumbling timbers, the eerie emptiness of the place. Inside one of the buildings, I found strange carvings etched into the wood. Geometric symbols and spirals that didn't look like miners' markings. I stayed out longer than I intended, losing track of time as the light began to fade. By the time I made it back to my RV, the sun was dipping below the mountains. The air had grown colder, and the shadows seemed longer, darker. Still, I told myself it was just another night. I'd camped in remote places before. That was the first night I heard the knocking. It started faintly, just a soft tap on the side of the RV. I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, but when I stepped outside to check, there was nothing. No wind, no branches, nothing nearby that could explain the noise. As I climbed back inside, I noticed how still the night was. There were no crickets, no rustling in the bushes, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. I shook it off and locked the door, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the tapping came again. Louder this time, followed by a faint whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My pulse quickened, and for the first time I felt a sliver of unease. The next day I decided to venture into the mines. It was a calculated risk. I knew the structures could be unstable, but the promise of unseen history was too tempting to resist. The entrance was dark and yawning, like the mouth of some ancient beast. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating walls streaked with soot and remnants of old tools left behind. About 50 feet in, I found a miner's helmet, its rusted shell half buried in the dirt. Nearby lay a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The entries were short, scrawled in shaky handwriting. We shouldn't have come here. They're watching us, moving in the dark. I hear them at night, whispers, scratching. A chill ran down my spine. I shoved the journal into my bag, suddenly eager to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing off the narrow walls. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I swung the flashlight around, but the tunnel was empty. My heart pounded as I hurried back to the entrance, the sound of my own footsteps deafening in the confined space. I could have sworn I heard another set of footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Back at the RV, I flipped through the journal. The entries grew more frantic as the pages went on, describing strange lights, missing tools, and men vanishing without a trace. The final entry was barely legible. "They want us to join them. The mine is hungry." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the lingering fear. Ghost stories, I reminded myself. Just ghost stories. But that night, the knocking returned. Louder, more insistent. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of pickaxes striking rock, the rhythmic clinking growing louder and louder, until it seemed to reverberate inside my skull. I looked out the window and froze. Glowing lights, like lanterns, floated in and out of the trees, moving toward the mine. And in the distance, just at the edge of the woods, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its outline barely visible in the faint moonlight. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I met a woman on the trail. Kara, she said her name was. She was friendly but jittery, her eyes darting around the woods like she expected something to jump out at any moment. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. She nodded, her face pale. "Voices. They sounded wrong. I'm heading out today. You should too." I wanted to believe she was overreacting, but a part of me knew she wasn't. Still, I told myself I needed one more day to finish my work. That night, I regretted staying. It started with a shadow moving outside the RV. Then came the whispers, louder than before, overlapping in an unintelligible cacophony. When I looked out the window, I saw them. Shapes moving through the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I locked the doors and turned off the lights, hoping they wouldn't notice me. But then the RV began to shake violently, as if something or someone was trying to tip it over. My camera bag fell to the floor, spilling its contents. One of the photos caught my eye. It was a shot I'd taken of the mine entrance, but in the background, faint and blurry, were several figures. Miners, their faces twisted and hollow, their bodies unnaturally contorted. I grabbed my bag and bolted. The trail back to the road felt endless. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of them, emaciated forms with coal-blackened skin, their empty eyes glowing like embers. They didn't run, but they didn't stop either, always just far enough behind to keep me moving. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The whispers grew louder, almost taunting, until they were all I could hear. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled into a clearing and saw the ranger station. Jim was standing on the porch, his face grim as he waved me inside. "What did I tell you?" he muttered, slamming the door behind me. "They're real," I gasped. "The miners, they're still there." Jim nodded, lighting an old lantern filled with a thick, oily liquid. "Spirits, angry ones. They don't let people leave once they've been marked." "Marked?" I repeated, my voice shaking. He gestured to the symbols on the walls of the station. "Wards. They keep them out, but you've been in the mine, haven't you?" I nodded, my stomach sinking. "Then they won't stop until they've got you." The station shook as the spirits closed in, their shadows stretching across the windows. Jim handed me the lantern. "Take this, head for the road and don't stop. They hate the light. Whatever you do, don't look back." I didn't argue. Gripping the lantern tightly, I bolted out the door and ran. The spirits followed, their guttural cries echoing through the trees. The light kept them at bay, but only barely. When I finally reached the road, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. The spirits stopped at the edge of the forest, their glowing eyes watching as I collapsed onto the asphalt. I never went back for the RV. Jim had warned me not to, and I didn't want to test my luck. Back in my apartment, I reviewed the photos again. In the last shot, taken just before I ran, I saw myself standing at the mine entrance. Surrounding me were the miners, their hollow faces staring directly at the camera. I don't know how they got so close without me noticing, and I don't want to. Some things are better left forgotten. My name is Sam, and I'm 26 years old. This happened just last year, during a camping trip that was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my girlfriend Megan and my best friend Kyle. We were young, adventurous, and maybe a little too cocky for our own good. None of us thought anything bad could actually happen to us out there. I still wish that were true. It was late August, and we'd planned the trip to Auta Lake in Alaska, deep in Chugach State Park. Megan loved anything outdoorsy, especially when it came with a good ghost story. She'd been researching the Denali legends, local tales about the skinwalkers, shapeshifters that could take the form of animals or even people to stalk and harm their prey. I'd laughed it off, as usual, telling her it was just campfire nonsense. Kyle had backed me up, cracking a joke about how the scariest thing out there would be a moose. The plan was simple: hike a few miles off the beaten path, camp by the lake, and enjoy some peace and quiet. But from the moment we arrived, things felt off. We parked the car at the trailhead around noon, the sun high and the sky clear. It was perfect hiking weather, but the moment we stepped onto the trail, I noticed how quiet it was. No bird song, no rustling in the underbrush, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt. "Creepy, right?" Megan said, falling into step beside me. "You know, the Denali believed the skinwalkers could mimic sounds to lure people into the woods." I rolled my eyes. Yeah, well, they'd better not try mimicking a bear or I'm out. Kyle laughed behind us, adjusting his pack. "Relax, man. The scariest thing out here is probably a squirrel." We hiked for hours, finally reaching a secluded spot along the lake. It was breathtaking, the water a deep, glassy blue reflecting the surrounding mountains. We set up camp close to the tree line, a little farther from the water than I'd wanted, but Megan insisted it was more authentic that way. That night, we lit a small fire and sat around it, trading stories. Megan, of course, brought up the skinwalkers again. "They're not just legends," she said, poking the fire with a stick. "The Denali say they're witches, people who've used dark magic to transform. They can shift into animals, but they're always wrong, like something's off about them. They can mimic voices too, even people you know." "Sounds like Bigfoot's creepier cousin," Kyle joked, but his laughter sounded a little forced. Things started going wrong the next morning. It had rained overnight, and our tent leaked badly. Megan and I woke up damp and shivering, and Kyle complained that the coffee he was trying to make tasted like ash because we couldn't keep the fire lit. Worse, we discovered that Kyle had forgotten the cooler with most of our food. We only had a few granola bars and some trail mix. "That's it?" Megan groaned, digging through her pack. "Kyle, I told you to double-check the gear." "Hey, I'm sorry, all right?" Kyle snapped. "It's not like I did it on purpose." I stepped in before the argument could escalate. Let's just make the best of it. We'll fish or something later. But the tensions lingered. We spent the day hiking farther along the lake, hoping to distract ourselves. The quiet from the previous day was still there, even deeper into the woods. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of the water lapping against the shore. That evening, as we sat around the fire eating what little we had, Megan froze, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, suddenly on edge. "A voice," she said. It sounded like you, Sam." Kyle laughed nervously. "Come on, Meg. You're just psyching yourself out." But Megan's face stayed pale, and she didn't say much for the rest of the night. The first real scare came later that night. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the usual rustle of an animal. These were deliberate, heavy steps, circling the campsite. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The fire had died down to embers, but I could just make out the shape of something tall moving between the trees. It didn't look like a bear or a moose. It looked human. "Megan," I whispered, shaking her awake. "There's someone out there." She sat up, her eyes wide. "What do you mean, someone?" Before I could answer, the footsteps stopped, and a low, guttural cry echoed through the woods. It sounded almost human, but not quite, like a person trying to scream through a broken throat. Megan grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next morning, we found footprints in the dirt around our camp. They were long and narrow, like a person's, but the toes were clawed, like an animal's. Kyle tried to laugh it off, but his hands shook as he packed his gear. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," he said, "like some local messing with tourists." "Right," Megan said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "because that's normal behavior." We decided to hike back toward the main trail, but the deeper into the woods we went, the more disoriented we became. The trail seemed to shift, the trees closing in tighter around us. Kyle started to lag behind, staring off into the distance like he was in a trance. "Kyle, you all right?" I called back. He didn't answer, just kept walking like he didn't hear me. When I grabbed his shoulder, he flinched, his eyes wild. "I'm fine," he snapped. "Let's just keep moving." But he wasn't fine. That night, back at camp, he refused to eat or talk. He just sat by the fire, staring into the flames. When I asked him what was wrong, he muttered something I couldn't make out and went to bed early. The final night was the worst. I woke up to Kyle screaming. Megan and I scrambled out of the tent to find him thrashing on the ground, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here!" he yelled. "It's here!" "What's here?" I shouted, trying to hold him still. But before he could answer, a figure stepped out of the woods. It was tall, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It looked human, but its face was wrong, stretched, almost animal-like, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. Megan screamed, and the thing turned toward her, mimicking her voice in a distorted, guttural tone. "Help me!" And I grabbed the nearest stick and swung it at the creature. But it dodged easily, its movements jerky and inhuman. Kyle broke free from my grip and ran into the woods. The creature followed, its long limbs carrying it unnaturally fast. "Kyle!" I yelled, but he was already gone. Megan grabbed my arm, tears streaming down her face. "We have to go, Sam. We have to go now." We ran all night, the creature's cries echoing through the woods behind us. At one point, Megan tripped and fell, scraping her knees. I picked her up and we kept going, adrenaline the only thing keeping us moving. As dawn broke, we stumbled onto the main trail, exhausted and bloodied. A park ranger found us shortly after, his expression grim as we told him what had happened. "You're lucky you made it out," he said, his tone serious. "People don't usually come back from that part of the park." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw it again. The tall, twisted figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I still hear it sometimes in my dreams. That low, guttural cry, like a broken voice trying to scream. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to. All I know is that I'll never go back to Eklutna. Some places are better left alone. My name is Emily Hart, and I'm 31 years old. This happened 2 summers ago, during a solo camping trip in Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. I had parked my RV near a place called Hollow Creek, a secluded area I'd read about online. I wanted to spend a few quiet days away from my job as a travel nurse, decompressing in the wilderness. I wasn't prepared for what I found, or what found me. The arrival. I arrived in Hollow Creek on a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that made the wilderness seem almost welcoming. The creek itself was beautiful, winding through tall pines and moss-covered rocks, the water so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom. I parked my RV in a clearing not far from the water and set up camp. A fisherman named Joe Markham stopped by as I was unloading. He was wiry, with a sun-weathered face and a thick Alaskan accent. "You camping alone out here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just me and the creek." He frowned. "Hollow Creek's not the friendliest place. A lot of strange things happen here." "Like what?" He leaned on his fishing pole. "Drownings. People vanish without a trace. Locals say it's the Kalupalik." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Old stories. Water spirits. They sing to you, make you think you're hearing something beautiful. But it's a trap. They'll drag you under and you'll never come back." I laughed nervously. "Thanks for the warning." Joe's eyes narrowed. "Just be careful, miss. If you hear something out of place, don't follow it." That first night was uneventful, almost too quiet. The forest had a stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. As I sat by my fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint humming, soft and melodic, drifting through the trees. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was strangely beautiful, like a lullaby sung by someone underwater. I chalked it up to the creek and tried to ignore it, but it stayed with me long after I climbed into bed. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, taking my sketchbook with me. Drawing had always been my way of clearing my mind, and the scenery was perfect for it. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled across another campsite. At first, I thought someone might still be there. There was a tent, a camp chair, even a pair of boots neatly placed by the water. But something felt off. The tent was zipped open, and the inside was empty. The campfire was cold, and the boots looked untouched, like they'd been abandoned. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The humming returned, louder now, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to look around or leave. The unease won out, and I turned back toward my RV. The first encounter. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the creek, sketching the water. The humming started again, faint but persistent, like it was calling to me. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to grow louder the longer I sat there. Curiosity got the better of me. I leaned over the water, scanning for the source. That's when I saw it. A pale, humanoid face just beneath the surface, staring up at me with glowing green eyes. Its skin was translucent, its features sharp and alien. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. The creature vanished, leaving the water rippling in its wake. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the creek, but it was gone. The encounter rattled me enough that I decided to pack up the next morning. But as I walked back toward the creek to fill my water bottle, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They weren't human. They were large and webbed, like a frog's, but far too big. I followed them upstream and found an old, crumbling cabin near the water's edge. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of rot. Dusty tools and rusted pans were scattered across the floor, and in the corner I found a journal. The entries were written in shaky handwriting and dated back to the 1940s. They told the story of a miner who'd worked in the area, describing how children had gone missing near the creek. He blamed the singing woman with green eyes and wrote about seeing her drag a boy into the water. The last entry read, "Fire and light, it's the only way to keep them away. The Auta Lake's wrath." That night, the humming grew louder. It surrounded my RV, circling like a predator stalking its prey. My flashlight flickered and died, and my phone refused to turn on. Then came the voices. "Emily, help me!" It was my mother's voice, followed by my best friend's and then a patient's voice. A child I'd lost during surgery. Each voice begged, pleaded, drawing me closer to the water. I covered my ears and screamed, "You're not real! Leave me alone!" The humming stopped. The silence was worse. When I looked outside, the creek was glowing, its surface alive with pale, humanoid figures. Their gills flared as they rose from the water, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Their mouths moved, singing the haunting melody that had lured so many before me. I remembered the journal. "Fire and light," I muttered. I rummaged through my RV, grabbing a can of lighter fluid and a box of matches. My hands shook as I ran outside and doused the edge of the creek in fluid. The Auta Lake hissed, their song growing discordant, but they didn't retreat. One of them lunged at me, its claws catching my arm. I screamed and struck a match, tossing it onto the soaked ground. The fire roared to life, forcing the creatures back. They writhed and shrieked, their translucent skin blistering in the flames. The water boiled unnaturally, the creek churning as if alive. One by one, the Auta Lake disappeared beneath the surface. By morning, the creek was calm. The fire burned out. I found Carly's boots on the shore, but no other trace of her. Shaking, I packed my RV and left Hollow Creek. As I drove away, I thought I heard the faintest melody, like a lullaby carried on the wind. I don't know if I'll ever camp again. The wilderness isn't as empty as we think, and sometimes the water sings back. My name is Emily Hart, and I'm 31 years old. This happened 2 summers ago during a solo camping trip in Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. I had parked my RV near a place called Hollow Creek, a secluded area I'd read about online. I wanted to spend a few quiet days away from my job as a travel nurse, decompressing in the wilderness. I wasn't prepared for what I found, or what found me. The arrival. I arrived in Hollow Creek on a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that made the wilderness seem almost welcoming. The creek itself was beautiful, winding through tall pines and moss-covered rocks, the water so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom. I parked my RV in a clearing not far from the water and set up camp. A fisherman named Joe Markham stopped by as I was unloading. He was wiry, with a sun-weathered face and a thick Alaskan accent. "You camping alone out here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just me and the creek." He frowned. Hollow Creek's not the friendliest place. A lot of strange things happen here. Like what? He leaned on his fishing pole. Drownings. People vanish without a trace. Locals say it's the Auta Lake. I raised an eyebrow. What's that? Old stories, water spirits. They sing to you, make you think you're hearing something beautiful. But it's a trap. They'll drag you under and you'll never come back. I laughed nervously. Thanks for the warning. Joe's eyes narrowed. Just be careful, miss. If you hear something out of place, don't follow it. That first night was uneventful, almost too quiet. The forest had a stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. As I sat by my fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint humming, soft and melodic, drifting through the trees. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was strangely beautiful, like a lullaby sung by someone underwater. I chalked it up to the creek and tried to ignore it, but it stayed with me long after I climbed into bed. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, taking my sketchbook with me. Drawing had always been my way of clearing my mind, and the scenery was perfect for it. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled across another campsite. At first, I thought someone might still be there. There was a tent, a camp chair, even a pair of boots neatly placed by the water. But something felt off. The tent was zipped open, and the inside was empty. The campfire was cold, and the boots looked untouched, like they'd been abandoned. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. The humming returned, louder now, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to look around or leave. The unease won out, and I turned back toward my RV. The first encounter. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, I sat by the creek, sketching the water. The humming started again, faint but persistent, like it was calling to me. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to grow louder the longer I sat there. Curiosity got the better of me. I leaned over the water, scanning for the source. That's when I saw it. A pale, humanoid face just beneath the surface, staring up at me with glowing green eyes. Its skin was translucent, its features sharp and alien. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. The creature vanished, leaving the water rippling in its wake. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the creek, but it was gone. The encounter rattled me enough that I decided to pack up the next morning. But as I walked back toward the creek to fill my water bottle, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They weren't human. They were large and webbed, like a frog's, but far too big. I followed them upstream and found an old, crumbling cabin near the water's edge. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of rot. Dusty tools and rusted pans were scattered across the floor, and in the corner, I found a journal. The entries were written in shaky handwriting and dated back to the 1940s. They told the story of a miner who'd worked in the area, describing how children had gone missing near the creek. He blamed the singing woman with green eyes and wrote about seeing her drag a boy into the water. The last entry read, "Fire and light. It's the only way to keep them away. The Auta Lake's wrath." That night, the humming grew louder. It surrounded my RV, circling like a predator stalking its prey. My flashlight flickered and died, and my phone refused to turn on. Then came the voices. "Emily, help me." It was my mother's voice, followed by my best friend's, and then a patient's voice. A child I'd lost during surgery. Each voice begged, pleaded, drawing me closer to the water. I covered my ears and screamed, "You're not real! Leave me alone!" The humming stopped. The silence was worse. When I looked outside, the creek was glowing, its surface alive with pale, humanoid figures. Their gills flared as they rose from the water, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Their mouths moved, singing the haunting melody that had lured so many before me. I remembered the journal. Fire and light, I muttered. I rummaged through my RV, grabbing a can of lighter fluid and a box of matches. My hands shook as I ran outside and doused the edge of the creek in fluid. The kalupalik hissed, their song growing discordant, but they didn't retreat. One of them lunged at me, its claws catching my arm. I screamed and struck a match, tossing it onto the soaked ground. The fire roared to life, forcing the creatures back. They writhed and shrieked, their translucent skin blistering in the flames. The water boiled unnaturally, the creek churning as if alive. One by one, the kalupalik disappeared beneath the surface. By morning, the creek was calm, the fire burned out. I found Carly's boots on the shore, but no other trace of her. Shaking, I packed my RV and left Hollow Creek. As I drove away, I thought I heard the faintest melody, like a lullaby carried on the wind. I don't know if I'll ever camp again. The wilderness isn't as empty as we think, and sometimes the water sings back. My name is Jack Keegan, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in the fall of 2021 during one of my solo RV trips through the vast wilderness of Alaska. I'd been camping and exploring for years, mostly to escape the noise of the world and my own regrets. This trip to Chugach National Forest was supposed to be just like all the others, peaceful, solitary, and uneventful. I was wrong. I started off from a small town on the edge of the forest, my RV stocked with supplies for a week of fishing, hiking, and sitting under the stars. It was my way of resetting, of leaving behind the guilt that always seemed to follow me. While refueling at a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with an older man named Eddie Monahan. He was a wiry guy with a weathered face and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed, like he was always expecting trouble. "You camping out there alone?" Eddie asked, leaning against the pump. "Yeah," I said. "Just me and the trees." He shook his head. "You be careful. Chugach isn't always friendly to folks like you, ones looking for solitude. You hear about the Devil's Lantern?" I laughed. "No, but I'm guessing it's a good campfire story." Eddie's face darkened. "Ain't no story. Folks disappear out there, always the same. They follow the lights, thinking it's someone lost or a campfire. Then they're gone. No trace, no nothing." "Ghost lights, huh?" I said, trying to sound amused. "Thanks for the warning." I drove deep into the forest, finally parking near a secluded lake that looked like a postcard come to life. The air was crisp, the water still, and the silence exactly what I needed. The first night, as I sat by the fire nursing a beer, I noticed faint blue-green lights flickering across the lake. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight or bioluminescence, but the way they danced and moved, like they were alive, sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I decided to explore the trails. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were my boots crunching leaves and the occasional rustle of wildlife. It wasn't long before I came across something that stopped me cold, a torn campsite. The tent was slashed open from the inside, the fabric flapping weakly in the wind. A hiking pack lay nearby, its contents spilled across the ground. Clothes, a water bottle, a notebook. It didn't look like an animal attack. It looked like panic. I crouched down and sifted through the items, my stomach twisting. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" No answer. The forest was so quiet it felt like the trees were holding their breath. That's when I saw it. An old, rusted lantern hanging from a low branch. It glowed faintly, the same eerie blue-green as the lights on the lake. I hesitated before reaching for it. an irrational fear prickling the back of my neck. As soon as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The air seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and for a moment, I thought I heard voices, soft, murmuring, just beyond understanding. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away from the lantern, my heart pounding. The warnings intensify. That night, I tried to shake the unease. I sat in my RV, sipping coffee and reading, but the image of the torn campsite and the glowing lantern kept creeping into my thoughts. Then the lights returned. They surrounded my RV this time, flickering like ghostly flames in the trees. My flashlight wouldn't work and my phone was dead, despite being fully charged earlier. The voices came again, faint but clear now. They were calling my name. "Jack, help me! Jack!" I froze. It wasn't just random voices. It was Sophie, the hiker I'd met briefly near the trailhead that morning. She'd seemed cheerful and confident, but now she sounded terrified. Against every instinct, I opened the door and stepped outside. The lights retreated, moving deeper into the woods. "Sophie?" I called. "Where are you?" The lights flickered almost playfully, leading me farther from the RV. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the dark, I found myself in a clearing. There, in the center, was Sophie. She was sitting on the ground, her back to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Sophie?" I said cautiously, stepping closer. She didn't respond. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her arms were limp at her sides. Something about her was wrong. I reached out, and as my hand touched her shoulder, she turned to face me. Her eyes were empty, not hollow, but literally glowing with the same eerie blue-green light as the lantern. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "They all follow the lights," she said, her voice layered with a dozen others. "They all become part of him." I staggered back as the clearing lit up, revealing bones, human bones, scattered everywhere. Some were ancient, covered in moss. Others looked disturbingly fresh. The air grew heavy, and the light coalesced into a figure. A man, or what used to be a man. He was tall, impossibly thin, with skin stretched tight over his bones, and eyes that burned like the lantern. In his hand, he held the glowing object itself, its flame flickering unnaturally. "The miner," I whispered, remembering Eddie's story. The miner's voice was like gravel grinding against steel. "You carry guilt," he said, stepping closer. "It makes you easy prey." I tried to run, but the air felt like molasses, holding me in place. The miner raised the lantern, and I saw images flash before my eyes. My failed rescue mission, the family I couldn't save, their faces twisted in agony. "You followed the lights," the miner said, his voice low and menacing. "Now, you belong to me." Through the haze of fear, I remembered the journal I'd found among the scattered belongings in Sophie's campsite. It had mentioned the lantern's curse and how to break it. "The fire," I muttered. "Destroy it in fire." Summoning every ounce of strength, I lunged at the miner, grabbing the lantern from his skeletal grip. The metal burned my hands, but I didn't let go. The miner howled, his form flickering like a dying flame, and the bones on the ground began to rattle. I ran, clutching the lantern, the lights chasing me like vengeful spirits. Back at the RV, I grabbed my emergency flare gun and aimed at the lantern. "Let this end," I said, firing. The flare hit the lantern, engulfing it in flames. The explosion was deafening, and the light was blinding. When it cleared, the forest was silent. The lights were gone. I found Sophie a few yards away, unconscious but alive. I carried her back to the RV, which miraculously started without issue. We drove out of Chugach that night, leaving behind the cursed woods and the miner's ghost. Sophie doesn't talk about what happened, and I don't blame her. As for me, I've sworn off camping in Alaska's wilderness. The memory of those lights and the miner's voice still haunt me. And sometimes in the darkest nights, I think I see a faint blue-green glow in the distance, flickering like a ghostly flame. My name is Ryan Porter. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in February 2024. I've been camping and hiking my whole life, but nothing I've ever experienced compares to what I encountered at Eagle Peak Trailhead in Alaska. I went there to challenge myself, to push my limits as a survivalist, but what I found wasn't just the raw, untamed power of nature. It was something older, something hungry. It started with the snowstorm. I'd planned everything meticulously. My RV was stocked with food, my gear checked and double-checked, and I was ready to spend a week in the remote wilderness of Rangel St. Elias National Park. My goal was to hike to a glacier near Eagle Peak, document the journey for my blog, and prove to myself I could handle the solitude. The first 2 days were uneventful. I parked my RV at the trailhead, hiked a few miles to scout the area, and took some incredible photos of the vast, frozen landscape. The park was deserted, just the way I liked it. Solitude was a comfort to me, especially after my breakup with Clara, my girlfriend of 5 years. I still had her old voice recording saved on my phone, messages she'd left me during our adventures together. They were my way of staying connected to a part of my life I wasn't ready to let go of. On the third night, the storm hit. I'd seen the forecast, but I hadn't expected it to roll in so quickly or with such intensity. By the time I realized what was happening, the snow was coming down in thick sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing. I hunkered down in the RV, cranking the heater and wrapping myself in blankets. The plan was to wait it out and resume my hike once the weather cleared, but then the power went out. It started with a flicker. The lights dimmed, the heater stuttered, and then everything shut off completely. I wasn't too worried at first. I had backup batteries, a portable stove, and plenty of warm clothing. Still, the sudden loss of heat in the middle of a snowstorm was unnerving. I spent the night bundled in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage outside. At some point, I thought I heard scratching, soft, rhythmic, like claws raking against the metal exterior of the RV. I told myself it was just the wind, branches brushing against the sides. But the sound didn't stop. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. The next morning, I ventured out to assess the damage. The snow was piled high against the RV, and the trailhead was barely visible beneath the white blanket. I grabbed my camera, thinking I might as well document the storm's aftermath, and that's when I saw it. A deer carcass lay about 20 feet from the RV. Its ribs jutted out like jagged teeth, the flesh stripped clean. At first, I thought it might have been wolves, but the tracks in the snow didn't make sense. They weren't paw prints, they were long, narrow, and clawed, like something I couldn't quite identify. I backed away slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. Whatever had killed the deer was big, and it had been close. Too close. By the fourth day, the storm had trapped me completely. The snow was too deep to hike through, and my supplies were dwindling faster than I'd anticipated. The generator still wasn't working, and the temperature inside the RV was dropping steadily. That night, the noises returned. At first, it was the scratching again, soft and persistent. Then came the thuds, heavy, deliberate, like footsteps circling the RV. I gripped my survival knife and flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice muffled by the howling wind. No response. Just the sound of something moving, just out of sight. I decided to stay awake, but exhaustion got the better of me. When I woke, the windows were fogged over, and my breath hung in the air. I reached for the flashlight, shining it around the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Claw marks. Deep, jagged gouges raked across the metal walls of the RV. The fifth day was worse. I tried to hike out, desperate to escape, but every trail I followed seemed to loop back to the RV. My compass spun uselessly, and the snowstorm had erased any recognizable landmarks. It was as if the forest itself was keeping me trapped. And then I started hearing her voice. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Clara's voice, soft and familiar, calling my name. Ryan. Ryan, I'm here. I froze, my heart racing. It couldn't be real. She wasn't here. She was hundreds of miles away, living her life without me. But the voice was so clear, so unmistakable, that I found myself following it. The trail led me deeper into the woods, past trees bent under the weight of snow. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Ryan, please help me. When I finally stopped, I saw it. A figure stood in the clearing, gaunt and impossibly tall. Its limbs were too long, its body emaciated, like a corpse stretched to its limits. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the pale light of the snow. And it was smiling. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, as if it were pressing down on my chest. I ran. That night, the wendigo came for me. I barricaded myself in the RV, piling furniture against the doors and windows. The generator was still dead, and the only light came from my flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. The scratching turned to pounding, the walls shaking with each impact. The creature's voice, Clara's voice, echoed all around me, pleading, laughing, taunting. Ryan, open the door. I'm cold. Let me in. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice was inside my head now, clawing at my sanity. When the pounding stopped, I thought it was over, but then I heard it. Something crawling on the roof, the sound of claws scraping against metal. And then the ceiling buckled. The next few hours were a blur of terror and adrenaline. I grabbed my camera, snapping photos blindly as the creature tore through the roof. The flash seemed to hurt it, causing it to recoil with a guttural snarl. Seizing the moment, I threw open the door and ran into the storm. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, the RV was barely visible, half buried in snow. The wendigo was gone, but I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. I was found 2 days later by a search and rescue team. They said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been left behind in those woods. When I reviewed the photos on my camera, my blood ran cold. The images were distorted, blurry. But one thing was clear. The creature's face, pale and grinning, staring back at me from the darkness. I don't know what it wanted, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Eagle Peak. My name is Nina Carter. I'm 35 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened during a solo RV camping trip to Devil's Creek Campground in Alaska. I'm a nature photographer. It's my job to seek beauty in the remote, the untouched, and sometimes the eerie. But what I found at Devil's Creek wasn't the kind of beauty you capture in a frame. It was the kind that stays with you, haunting you long after you've left. It started as a dream trip. 5 days alone in the Chugach National Forest. Just me, my camera, and the wilderness. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the jagged peaks. The campground was as remote as I'd hoped. Not a soul in sight except for the campground host, a man named Doug Miller. Doug was in his 40s, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed older than his years. When I pulled up, he gave me a quick once-over and nodded. "First time here?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe of his small cabin. "Yeah," I said, stepping out of the RV. "I'm hoping to photograph the northern lights. Heard this place is great for that." "It is," Doug said, his tone flat. "But you'd be smart to pack up before dark." I laughed nervously. "Why's that?" He scratched his beard, looking out towards the tree line. "These woods, they've got history, bad history. You stay too long, you'll feel it." I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess. Bears? Wolves?" "Worse," he said. "Shadow children." That stopped me. "Shadow what?" "Kids who went missing here decades ago. People say they never left. They play games with folks like you, loners who think they can handle these woods." I forced a smile, hoping to end the conversation. "Thanks for the warning." Doug just shrugged. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." The first night was uneventful. I set up my camera near the edge of the creek and took a few test shots of the stars. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the trickle of water. I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in months. The next morning, I found handprints on my RV. Small ones, smudged into the dust on the rear window. For a moment, I thought maybe some kids had wandered through the campground during the night, but the place had been dead silent. And besides, there weren't any families staying here, just me. I brushed it off and focused on my photography. The morning light was perfect, streaming through the trees in golden beams. But when I reviewed the shots later, something caught my eye. In the background of one photo, just beyond the focus point, was a shape. A dark, childlike silhouette standing among the trees. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had been no one there when I took the photo, I was sure of it. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, almost melodic. But then I heard it clearly, giggling. Children's laughter, faint but distinct, echoing through the trees. I stepped out of the RV, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small in the vast silence. The giggling stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, before retreating to the RV. As I locked the door, I noticed something on the windshield. A toy, a small broken wooden doll sitting on the wiper blade. I didn't sleep much that night. On the third day, I met Doug again. I'd driven into the campground office to ask about the trails, but really, I just wanted to see another person, to ground myself in something normal. Doug didn't seem surprised to see me. "They're messing with you, huh?" he asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. He chuckled, shaking his head. "They like to play games. Start small, moving things, noises. Then they get bolder." "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Spirits. Kids who got lost here years ago. Some say they drowned in the creek. Others think something worse happened to them. Whatever it was, they're still here." "And you just live with this?" Doug shrugged. "I stay out of their way. You should too." That night, a storm rolled in. Rain pounded against the RV and thunder shook the ground. I stayed inside, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. But the distortions were worse now. Every image was filled with strange shadows, shapes that shouldn't have been there. And then, I lost power. The lights flickered once, twice, and went out, plunging the RV into darkness. The whispers came again, louder this time. They seemed to be everywhere, outside, inside, all around me. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, heart racing. "Leave me alone!" I shouted. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain. And then a voice. "Come play with us." It was a child's voice, soft and sweet, but it sent a chill down my spine. The flashlight flickered, and in its beam, I saw them. 3 shadowy figures standing just outside the window, their faces featureless, but unmistakably childlike. I screamed and stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When I picked it up and shone it at the window again, they were gone. By the 5th day, I was desperate to leave, but the rain had flooded the campground, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. My RV was stuck, and my cell phone had no signal. I tried to hike out, but the trails seemed to twist and loop back on themselves, leading me in circles. It was as if the forest didn't want me to leave. As night fell, I found myself back at the creek. The water was higher now, rushing and frothing with the storm. The giggling started again, closer this time. "Come play," the voices said. "We're waiting." I turned to run, but they were there, blocking the path. Dozens of them now, their small, dark forms blending into the shadows. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock and falling hard. The voices grew louder, overlapping, drowning out the sound of the creek. In a panic, I reached into my bag and grabbed my camera. I held it up, snapping photos blindly, the flash cutting through the darkness. The figures recoiled at the light, their outlines dissolving like smoke. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the RV. I don't know how I made it through that night. When the storm finally broke and the roads cleared, I didn't look back. I drove until I was far away from Devil's Creek, my heart still racing. Later, when I reviewed the photos, I saw them clearly. Small, pale faces staring back at me, their eyes empty and black. In every frame, they were closer. I don't camp alone anymore. My name is Mason Cole. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2023. I've spent most of my adult life camping and hiking, testing myself against the wilderness. I thought I knew nature, its beauty, its dangers. But what I encountered in Denali National Park wasn't natural. It wasn't something you could fight with a knife or hide from in a tent. I took the trip to Denali to escape. Life had been suffocating me. After my dad's passing earlier that year, I found myself struggling to cope, retreating further into myself. Camping had always been my sanctuary, my way to reset. I'd been planning this trip for months, envisioning the vast, untamed Alaskan wilderness as the perfect place to find peace, or at least a temporary reprieve. I set off from Fairbanks in my RV, heading toward Denali's Savage River Loop Trail. The air was sharp and cold, and the sky was the kind of blue that seems infinite. I planned to spend 5 nights camping in the backwoods, away from the bustling trails and prying eyes of tourists. The idea of solitude thrilled me. I parked my RV near the trailhead and double-checked my gear: food, water filtration system, tent, survival knife, satellite radio. Everything seemed in order, and by mid-afternoon I was several miles into the woods, setting up camp near a quiet stream. The first night passed uneventfully. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the distant calls of wolves. It was comforting, in a way, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The trouble started on the 2nd day. I woke early and went to refill my water bottle from the stream, only to find my filtration system malfunctioning. It was a critical piece of equipment, and without it, I'd have to boil all my water. An inconvenience, but not insurmountable. Still, it was the first crack in my plans. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, I noticed something strange. Symbols, carved into the bark of trees, etched onto rocks along the trail. At first, I thought they were some kind of Park Service markers, but they didn't make any sense. They weren't numbers or letters, just strange, looping designs. I brushed it off as graffiti left by bored hikers. though I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong here. The wilderness was supposed to be untouched, but this felt deliberate. That night, the wolves were silent. I woke to the sound of something, or someone, rifling through my gear outside the tent. Heart pounding, I grabbed my knife and flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. My food cache, which I'd hung from a tree to keep it safe from bears, was on the ground, scattered. The rope I'd used to hang it had been cleanly severed as if sliced with a blade. I shone my flashlight into the trees, scanning for movement, but saw nothing. The forest was deathly still, the kind of quiet that sets your teeth on edge. I told myself it was a bear, though deep down I didn't believe it. On the third day I met Jake. I was hiking along the Savage River, following an unmarked trail I'd found on my map, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a park ranger, mid-40s, rugged, with a thick beard and piercing eyes. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out," he said, his tone friendly but cautious. "I like the solitude," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded, studying me for a moment. "You camping out here alone?" "Yeah, why?" Jake hesitated, then said, "These woods, they're different. You'd be smart to stick to the marked trails." I laughed nervously. "I've handled myself in the wilderness before. I'll be fine." Jake didn't laugh. "I'm not talking about bears or weather, son. There's old stuff in these woods. Stuff that doesn't take kindly to trespassers." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he tipped his hat and disappeared down the trail. That night, things escalated. I woke to a faint sound, like someone whispering my name. "Mason." At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard it again, louder this time, coming from the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, flashlight in hand. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It looked human, but something was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. When I shone my flashlight on it, it darted behind a tree with impossible speed. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every shadow. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave, but the woods wouldn't let me. Every trail I followed seemed to loop back to the same spot, as if the forest itself were shifting around me. My compass spun uselessly, and my map made no sense. As night fell, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't just my name. I heard my dad's voice, calling out to me, pleading for help. "Mason, please, don't leave me here." I knew it couldn't be real. My dad was gone. But the voice was so convincing, so full of pain, that I found myself moving toward it, deeper into the woods. That's when I saw them. A group of figures, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes empty black voids. They stood in a circle, watching me, their heads tilting in unison as if they were studying an insect. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their presence pressing against me, heavy and suffocating. I spent the final night by the fire, feeding it every scrap of wood I could find. The figures circled me just beyond the firelight, their guttural whispers filling the air. When the fire began to dwindle, I felt true terror. I was out of wood, out of options. I gripped my knife tightly, knowing it wouldn't do me any good. As the flames flickered and died, the figures closed in. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, it was dawn, and I was stumbling out of the woods, half frozen and delirious. Jake was waiting for me at the trailhead, his face grim. "You're lucky they let you go," he said quietly. I didn't ask who they were. I didn't want to know. I left Denali that day and haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again, and I wonder if I ever really left those woods. My name is Lucas Bennett, but everyone calls me Luke. I'm 31 years old, a professional nature photographer, and until last summer I didn't believe in anything I couldn't see through the lens of my camera. What happened at Auta Lake changed that forever. I had been on a solo trip through Alaska, capturing the untamed wilderness for a portfolio I planned to pitch to a major magazine. The trip had been perfect until I reached Chugach State Park and met Mila. It was my second day in the area, and I had stopped at a small visitor center near the park entrance to grab some trail maps and stretch my legs. Mila worked the front desk, a petite woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked as I flipped through the brochures. "Nope," I said, smiling, "just passing through, hoping to get some good shots of Auta Lake." Her expression darkened. "Eklutna's beautiful, but you'll want to stick to the main trails." "Why's that?" I asked, intrigued. She hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "People disappear out there. Locals say it's cursed, something about an old legend, the Silent Watcher. Ever heard of it?" I shook my head. Mila explained that the Silent Watcher was an ancient spirit tied to the lake, said to prey on those who wandered too far off the beaten path. It sounded like a campfire story, the kind of thing meant to spook tourists. "Thanks for the warning," I said, trying to sound polite, "but I think I'll be fine." Mila didn't look convinced. Before I left, she handed me a hand-drawn map of a secluded area near the lake. "If you're determined to go, at least try this spot," she said. "It's quiet. No one else will bother you there." Looking back, I wish I'd taken her first advice. The drive to Auta Lake was stunning, the kind of raw, unspoiled landscape photographers dream of. I arrived in the late afternoon and followed Mila's map to a small clearing near the water's edge. It was perfect, isolated, with a clear view of the lake framed by towering pines. I parked my RV, set up camp, and spent the rest of the evening taking photos as the sun dipped behind the mountains. As dusk settled, a strange stillness fell over the area. The wind died, and the usual hum of insects and birds went silent. It was eerie, but also oddly calming, like the world was holding its breath. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of water slapping against the shore. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. A faint voice, barely audible. "Lucas." My heart skipped. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The voice came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Lucas." I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the shoreline. The lake was calm, the surface like glass. No one was there. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to a dream and went back inside. But as I crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I explored the area around my campsite. The forest was dense, the kind of place where you could easily lose your sense of direction. As I wandered, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals, circles, and angular shapes that looked deliberate but unfamiliar. They reminded me of something Mila had said. Locals claim the Watcher leaves marks to claim her territory. I photographed the carvings, curious but not yet alarmed. When I returned to camp, I found something that stopped me cold. There were footprints in the dirt, barefoot, human, but impossibly large. They circled my RV, overlapping in a chaotic pattern. My first instinct was to laugh it off as a prank, but who would come all the way out here just to mess with me? That night, things escalated. I was reviewing the day's photos when my camera started acting up. The screen flickered, then went black. I tried turning it off and on, but it wouldn't respond. Frustrated, I plugged it into my laptop, only to find that half the images were corrupted, just static and distortions where clear shots had been hours earlier. Then the whispers returned. Lucas. This time, they were louder, closer. I turned off the lights and peered out the window. In the faint moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the lake. It was tall and thin, shrouded in mist. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but something about the way it stood, too still, too rigid, made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward and it vanished, dissolving into the mist like smoke. The air grew colder, and the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed up camp and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was fine, and there was plenty of gas, but it was dead. Stranded, I decided to hike back to the visitor center for help. As I walked, the forest seemed different. Darker, more oppressive. The carvings I'd photographed earlier were everywhere now, etched into nearly every tree I passed. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Lucas, don't leave." I stumbled into a clearing and froze. In the center was a pile of objects. Rusted camping gear, tattered clothing, and what looked like human bones. At the top of the pile was a notebook. I picked it up, flipping through pages filled with frantic, scrawled entries. "She's watching me. I can't leave. The water is calling." The last page was smeared with what looked like blood. "Help me." The sun was setting as I reached the lake again. The whispers had turned into a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, pulling me toward the water. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts foggy. I could see her now, standing in the shallows, a woman with pale, sunken features and long black hair. Her eyes were empty sockets, and yet I felt her gaze pierce through me. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice 100 voices in one. I took a step forward, then another. The water was freezing, but I couldn't stop. My mind screamed to turn back, but my body didn't obey. Then I remembered my camera. It was still around my neck, the flashlight attached. Desperate, I turned it on and aimed it at her. The flash erupted, blindingly bright in the darkness. She screamed, a sound like shattering glass, and vanished into the mist. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, only that it started without issue when I turned the key. I drove straight to the visitor center, where I found Mila waiting. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked, her face pale. I nodded, too shaken to speak. She handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You're lucky. Most people don't make it out." When I got home, I reviewed the photos on my camera. Most were blank or distorted, but one sent chills down my spine. It showed the lake, bathed in moonlight, with the figure of the witch standing at the edge. She wasn't looking at the water, she was looking at me. My name is Rebecca Lane, but most people know me as Becky. I'm 34 years old, a solo traveler, and a writer for my blog, Wheels on the Road. Last October, I took a trip up the Dalton Highway in Alaska, one of the most remote and treacherous roads in the world. I wanted to document its stark beauty and the challenges of traveling it alone. What I didn't expect was to come face to face with something I can't explain. The trip started smoothly enough. My RV, a reliable, if slightly battered vehicle affectionately named Rosie, had been my home on the road for 2 years. Equipped with all the essentials, Rosie and I had tackled deserts, mountains, and everything in between. The Dalton Highway was supposed to be just another adventure. The first couple of days were uneventful. I drove through vast stretches of tundra, the road stretching endlessly ahead like a ribbon cutting through the wilderness. At night, I parked in pullouts to admire the northern lights. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional howl of a distant wolf. On the third day, I met Ranger Glenn at a fuel stop near Coldfoot. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Traveling alone, huh?" he asked, eyeing my RV. "Always," I said with a smile. He didn't smile back. "Be careful up there. A lot of strange things happen on this road." "Strange how?" He hesitated, then said, "People hear things, see things. Some even disappear. Locals call it the Whisperer." I laughed nervously. "Like a ghost story?" "Call it what you want," he said, his tone serious. "Just don't stop for anything unusual. And if you hear someone talking to you when no one's there, turn around." I thanked him for the advice, but as I drove away, I dismissed it as local folklore. Alaska was full of ghost stories. That night, everything changed. I had parked Rosie at a pullout near the Arctic Circle. The night was bitterly cold, and frost coated the windows. I was reviewing photos on my laptop when my CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static. Then I heard it, a faint, distorted voice. "Turn! Back!" I froze. The voice was low and garbled, like it was coming from underwater. I grabbed the radio mic. "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. I told myself it was just interference, maybe a trucker on the highway or some atmospheric anomaly. Still, I double-checked the locks on the doors before crawling into bed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were faint, circling the RV. I held my breath, straining to listen. Was it an animal? A person? I grabbed my flashlight and threw on a coat. When I stepped outside, the cold bit into my skin and my breath hung in the air like smoke. I shone the flashlight around but saw nothing. No tracks in the frost, no sign of movement. But when I turned back to Rosie, my heart stopped. There were handprints on the frosted windows. 5 long fingers pressed against the glass. The prints were on the inside. The next day, I debated turning back. The ranger's warning played in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and decided to push on. I wasn't going to let a ghost story ruin my trip. But Rosie had other plans. About 10 miles past the last service station, the engine sputtered and died. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't start. The battery was fine, and I had plenty of gas, but something was wrong. I stepped out to check under the hood. The wind howled across the barren landscape, and the temperature was dropping fast. As I fiddled with the engine, I heard it again. The voice. "Turn back!" This time, it was louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the CB radio, it was coming from behind me. I spun around, and there he was. A man stood in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned trucker's cap and a flannel shirt. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Who are you?" I shouted. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed down the road. "Turn back," he said again, his voice echoing unnaturally. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. When I looked out the window, he was gone. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix Rosie, but nothing worked. By evening, I was freezing and exhausted. I decided to stay put for the night and try again in the morning. That was my mistake. Around midnight, I woke to a deep rumbling sound. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. Then I felt it, the ground shaking beneath me. I looked out the window and saw the mountains in the distance collapsing. Snow and rock cascaded down in a massive avalanche, burying the road ahead. if I hadn't been stranded, I would have driven straight into it. When dawn broke, I saw the full extent of the destruction. The road was impassable, buried under tons of debris. I was trapped, but I was alive. I don't know what the Whisperer was, ghost, guardian, or something else entirely. All I know is that he saved my life. A passing truck eventually rescued me, and I made it back to civilization. I wrote about the experience on my blog, but I left out the part about the ghost. Who would believe me? Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice on the wind. "Turn back," he whispers. And I wonder if he's still out there, protecting travelers from the dangers of the Dalton highway, or if he's waiting for me to return. Voce Dis. Give me another outline of an RV camping story with a different solo. My name is Jamie Carter, and I'm 27 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of last year, deep in Rangel, St. Elias National Park, Alaska. I don't know why I feel compelled to share it. Maybe to warn others, maybe just to convince myself it really happened. All I know is that the wilderness I used to love is no longer the place of peace I once thought it was. It started with 3 friends and an ambitious idea. Ethan, Vanessa, and I had been planning this trip for months. A week-long hike through Rangel's rugged trails, away from tourists and crowds. Ethan called it the ultimate escape. He had a way of making everything sound like an adventure, even when it clearly wasn't. Vanessa, on the other hand, was more like me, practical but excited. She'd brought her sketchbook and camera, hoping to capture the wilderness for her art. As for me, I just wanted to prove I could handle it. My last camping trip as a teenager had ended in disaster. Cold, rain, and a broken tent. I was determined to redeem myself. We chose a lesser-known trail, marked only on old maps and whispered about in forums for hardcore hikers. "It's perfect," Ethan had said, grinning like he'd already conquered it. Remote, real wilderness. The first day was uneventful, even beautiful. The trail wound through dense evergreens, opening occasionally to breathtaking views of glaciers in the distance. We laughed, took photos, and congratulated ourselves for making such a great choice. By the second day, though, things started to feel off. It began with the carvings. Vanessa noticed them first, strange symbols etched into tree trunks along the trail. At first, we thought they were just graffiti left by other hikers. But as we ventured deeper, the carvings became more intricate. They weren't words, but strange shapes, twisting spirals and angular patterns that didn't seem random. "Probably some kind of indigenous art," Ethan said, shrugging it off. "Cool, but not creepy." Vanessa didn't look convinced. "These are fresh," she said, running her fingers over the marks, like someone just made them. We didn't linger. The air felt heavier the further we walked, like the forest was pressing in on us. Birds were scarce, and even the wind seemed muted. By dusk, we found a clearing to set up camp. While Ethan fiddled with the stove, muttering curses when it refused to light, Vanessa sketched in her notebook. I watched her draw one of the carvings from memory, her pencil moving rapidly across the page. "I don't like this place," she said quietly, almost to herself. That night, I had the first dream. I was running through the woods, heart pounding, branches slashing at my face. Something was chasing me, something I couldn't see but could feel, its presence like a weight pressing against my chest. When I turned to look, I saw glowing eyes in the darkness. They weren't human. I woke up gasping, my sleeping bag damp with sweat. Vanessa was already awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent. "I heard something," she whispered. "What kind of something?" "Voices in the woods," They were saying my name. I wanted to tell her it was just the wind, but my throat felt tight. I hadn't heard voices, but the forest had been unnervingly silent since we'd arrived. Ethan, of course, slept through the whole thing, snoring loudly in his tent. The next day brought something worse. We'd been hiking for hours, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous. Around midday, we found the carcass of a moose. At first, I thought it had been killed by a bear. Its ribs were torn open, the flesh mangled. But there were no claw marks, no tracks leading away. And the ribs, they were splayed outward, like something had burst from inside. Ethan crouched beside the body, poking it with a stick. "What the hell could have done this?" he muttered. Vanessa gagged and turned away. "We need to leave." Ethan waved her off. "It's nature. Stuff like this happens all the time." But it didn't feel like nature. It felt wrong, like the forest itself was watching us. As we moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, too quick to be an animal, too large to be human. That night, the whispers started. We'd set up camp near a stream, hoping the sound of running water would calm our nerves. But as we sat around the fire, the air grew still. Then I heard it. A faint voice, almost too quiet to make out. It was coming from the woods, calling my name, "Jamie." I froze, staring into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Vanessa nodded, her face pale. "It said my name, too." Ethan stood up, shining his flashlight toward the trees. "Who's out there? Show yourself!" The beam of light swept across the trunks, illuminating nothing but shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we decided to turn back. The trail that had seemed so clear now felt like a maze. Landmarks we'd passed before were gone, replaced by dense forest and unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the woods had shifted overnight. Vanessa was the first to crack. "We're lost," she said, her voice trembling. "This place is messing with us." Ethan tried to reassure her, but his confidence was slipping. The cocky grin he always wore was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. For the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid. Then we found the footprints. They were human, or at least they looked human at first glance. But the toes were elongated, the prints impossibly deep, as if whatever had made them weighed hundreds of pounds. They circled our campsite from the night before, overlapping in a chaotic pattern. "This isn't funny," Vanessa said, her voice breaking. "Who's doing this?" No one answered. We were too scared to admit the truth. We were being hunted. By the 5th day, we were running low on food and water. My ankle, which I'd twisted on a loose rock, was slowing us down. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step, the trees pressing closer together. I started to wonder if we'd ever get out. That's when we saw it. It stood on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the fading light. At first, I thought it was a man, tall and gaunt, with long limbs. But then it moved, its joints bending at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dying sun like mirrors. Vanessa screamed, and the thing turned its head toward us. Even from a distance, I could feel its hunger, a gnawing, desperate need that made my stomach churn. "Run," Ethan whispered. "Don't look back." We ran. The creature didn't chase us at first. It followed, its footsteps silent but ever present. Every time we stopped to catch our breath, it was closer. We couldn't outrun it, and we couldn't fight it. We were trapped. That night, huddled around a dying fire, Vanessa made a decision. "I'll distract it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "No," I said. we stay together. You can barely walk, Jamie, she shot back. And Ethan, you're the fastest. You can get help. Ethan protested, but Vanessa was resolute. Before we could stop her, she grabbed a burning branch from the fire and ran into the woods, screaming at the top of her lungs. The wendigo followed. We waited until the screams stopped before moving. Ethan half carried me as we stumbled through the dark, guided only by the faint glimmer of moonlight. By dawn, we found a ranger station, a small, weathered building on the edge of the park. We were safe, but Vanessa was gone. The rangers organized a search, but they never found her. They chalked it up to a tragic accident. Lost hikers was the official explanation. Ethan and I didn't argue. We couldn't explain what had really happened without sounding insane. Sometimes I wonder if Vanessa made it out. But then I remember the last thing I found in my backpack, a small carved antler. I don't know how it got there, and I don't want to know. The whispers haven't stopped.